In the prestigious halls of Roosevelt Elementary, Maria walks quietly, her footsteps barely audible on the polished marble floors that echo with the chatter of privileged children. The scent of fresh flowers from the main office mingles with the smell of expensive lunches being prepared in the cafeteria. She moves through these corridors like a ghost, invisible to most, carrying her worn backpack and clutching a small, weathered notebook against her chest. Every morning at 7:30 sharp, Maria arrives early, not because she's eager for school, but because the empty hallways feel safer than the crowded ones. The fluorescent lights hum overhead, casting harsh shadows that seem to follow her as she makes her way to her locker. Her fingers trace the cold metal combination lock, 15 to 23 to 8, numbers she's memorized, not just for their sequence, but as a ritual of preparation for another day of being overlooked, dismissed, and worse. No one knows that behind those quiet brown eyes lies a mind that processes mathematical equations like poetry. No one even notices when she solves complex problems in her head, while other students struggle with basic multiplication. Her teachers see her hesitation to speak as a sign of confusion rather than the careful translation happening in her mind. Switching between Spanish and English, between the language of her heart and the language of acceptance. But when Mrs. Peterson's fifth-grade class erupts into chaos over an impossible word problem on the whiteboard, Maria observes from the back corner where she always sits. The other students throw their hands up in frustration, their voices rising in complaint. "This is too hard!" shouts Tommy, his designer sneakers kicked up on his desk. "Nobody can solve this," adds Ashley, flipping her blonde hair with practiced disdain. Mrs. Peterson's face flushes red as she struggles to break down the problem into smaller pieces, her voice growing sharper with each failed attempt to reach her students. The air grows thick with tension and the acrid smell of dry erase markers. 28 pairs of eyes stare blankly at the board, but one pair sees something different entirely. What they didn't know was that Maria had been solving problems like this since she was 7 years old, helping her father calculate construction measurements when he came home exhausted from 12-hour shifts. Her small fingers had traced numbers in the dust of unfinished houses, her mind wrapping around concepts that would challenge students years older than her. The problem on the board wasn't impossible. It was beautiful. Maria could see the solution, unfolding in her mind like a blooming flower, each step logical, elegant, inevitable. Her hand moved slightly, as if to raise it, but stopped midway. She'd learned that her answers, delivered in her soft voice with its slight accent, often earned more scrutiny than praise. But today, something felt different. Maybe it was the way the sunlight streamed through the classroom windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced like possibilities in the air. Maybe it was the memory of her grandmother's voice whispering, "Tú eres más fuerte de lo que crees." "Mija, you are stronger than you think, my daughter." The classroom had fallen into an uncomfortable silence. Mrs. Peterson's marker hovered uncertainly over the whiteboard. The digital clock on the wall ticked loudly. 10:47 a.m. In 13 minutes, it would be time for recess, and another opportunity would slip away into the void of missed chances that seemed to define Maria's school experience. And with just one raised hand and a quietly spoken answer, she was about to change everything. Not just for herself, but for every child who had ever felt invisible in a room full of people who couldn't see their worth. Because sometimes the smallest voices carry the biggest truths, and sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin with a single moment of courage from someone everyone underestimated. Before we continue with Maria's incredible story, I need to ask you something important. If this story is resonating with you, if you've ever felt overlooked or underestimated, please hit that subscribe button right now. This channel is dedicated to sharing the untold stories of everyday heroes who changed the world one brave moment at a time. And here's what I want to know. On a scale of 0 to 10, how often do you speak up when you know the answer but feel afraid to share it? Drop your number in the comments below, because Maria's journey is about to show us all why our voices matter more than we think. Now, let's get back to that classroom where everything was about to change, and discover what happened when one teacher finally saw what had been hidden in plain sight. Maria Elena Rodriguez had walked through those same school doors for 3 years, ever since her family moved to Riverside Gardens when she was 8 years old. Her father, Roberto, had saved every penny from his construction job to move them into this district, believing that a better school meant a better future for his daughter. What he hadn't anticipated was how different better would feel for a little girl whose lunch came in a brown paper bag, while her classmates opened insulated boxes filled with organic snacks and handwritten notes from stay-at-home mothers. Each morning, Maria performed the same ritual. She'd smooth down her dark hair, carefully braided by her mother's tired hands before the 5 a.m. shift at the hospital cafeteria. She'd check her backpack twice for her homework, always completed, but written in pencil, because pens felt too permanent, too confident for someone still learning to trust her own voice. The walk from the apartment complex took exactly 12 minutes, past manicured lawns and houses with 3-car garages, each step a reminder of the invisible line she crossed every day. The teachers at Roosevelt Elementary walked by her as if she were furniture, present, necessary, but unremarkable. They knew her name for attendance purposes, nodded politely during parent-teacher conferences conducted in broken English, with her father's calloused hands folded nervously in his lap. But Maria watched. She always watched. In math class, she noticed how Mrs. Peterson's eyes lit up when blonde Jessica correctly answered a division problem, the same enthusiasm that never appeared when Maria solved more complex equations in her workbook. During reading time, she observed how the teacher lingered at the desks of students whose parents volunteered for field trips, whose families could donate money for classroom supplies, whose accents didn't mark them as outsiders. But Maria had learned to find magic in the margins. While other students struggled with basic fractions, she was mentally calculating percentages and ratios from the grocery shopping she did with her mother every Saturday. When classmates complained about word problems, Maria was translating them into Spanish in her mind, solving them in her heart language, then translating the answers back, a cognitive dance that made simple problems complex and complex problems beautiful. On that particular Tuesday morning in October, Maria heard something that made her stomach flutter with recognition and fear. Mrs. Peterson had written a multi-step word problem on the whiteboard that involved calculating the cost of supplies for a school carnival, including discounts, tax, rates, and profit margins. The numbers seemed to dance before her eyes, not because they were difficult, but because they were so familiar. Every weekend, Maria helped her father calculate materials for his construction projects. She knew about markup percentages because she'd watched him figure out pricing to stay competitive while still feeding his family. She understood discounts because she'd learned to spot them at the grocery store, her young mind automatically adjusting quantities to maximize their food budget. These weren't abstract concepts from a textbook. They were the mathematics of survival, of dignity, of making a life work against impossible odds. Who can solve this problem? Mrs. Peterson asked, her voice carrying the slight edge of someone who had posed this question, knowing it might go unanswered. Maria's hand twitched. The answer was so clear in her mind, $847.50. She could see each step of the calculation, could trace the logical progression from raw numbers to final solution. But she'd learned that being right wasn't always enough. Last month, when she'd corrected a factual error during a history lesson about Mexico, several students had turned to stare at her with expressions that asked, "How would you know?" The teacher had thanked her politely, but moved on quickly, as if her knowledge was an interruption rather than a contribution. The silence in the classroom grew heavier. Tommy Morrison, whose father owned the largest car dealership in town, shook his head dramatically. "This is impossible, Mrs. Peterson. Nobody can do this kind of math." Ashley Chen, whose mother was president of the PTA, nodded in agreement. "We haven't learned this stuff yet. It's not fair." Maria moved closer to her desk, her heart pounding against her ribs. Those words weren't foreign to her. They were the language she spoke at home when helping her father, the vocabulary of necessity that had shaped her understanding of numbers as tools of empowerment rather than obstacles to overcome. She whispered, barely audible above the classroom's frustrated murmurs, "It's $847.50. Mrs. Peterson paused mid-sentence, her marker hovering over the whiteboard. "Excuse me." The answer, Maria repeated, her voice still soft, but steady now. With the 15% discount and the 8.25% tax rate, the total cost would be $847.50. Tommy Morrison turned in his seat with a smirk that Maria had seen too many times before. Yeah, right, like she would know. But deep inside, something had stirred. For the first time in 3 years at Roosevelt Elementary, Maria didn't look down at her desk. Instead, she met Mrs. Peterson's eyes and waited. The next morning, the 5th grade classroom buzzed with the nervous energy that comes before a big test. Mrs. Peterson had announced a mathematics competition between all the 5th grade classes at Roosevelt Elementary, with the winning team earning a pizza party and their picture in the school newsletter that went home to every family in the district. The stakes felt monumental to 10-year-olds whose social hierarchies were as rigid as any corporate boardroom. "We need our strongest math students," Mrs. Peterson announced, clipboard in hand as she surveyed the room. "I'll be selecting 4 students to represent our class." Predictably, the usual suspects raised their hands high. Tommy Morrison waved his arm enthusiastically, his confidence built on years of being chosen first for everything from kickball teams to class presentations. Ashley Chen sat up straighter, her perfect posture reflecting the extra tutoring sessions her parents paid for every Tuesday and Thursday. Marcus Williams, whose quick wit in verbal math games had earned him a reputation as the class numbers guy, cracked his knuckles theatrically. Maria sat in her usual spot in the back corner, her worn notebook open to a page covered in precise calculations she'd completed during lunch, while other students played on the playground. She'd worked through every practice problem in the math textbook twice, not because they were assigned, but because numbers felt like friends that never judged her accent or questioned her right to be there. The selection process felt like a foregone conclusion. Mrs. Peterson's eyes swept across the raised hands of eager volunteers, her pen already moving to write down the names everyone expected. But then, something unexpected happened. "Maria," Mrs. Peterson said suddenly, her voice carrying across the classroom like a small explosion, "I'd like you to be on the team." 28 heads turned toward the back corner where Maria sat, her dark eyes wide with surprise. The silence that followed was deafening, filled with the unspoken questions that hung in the air like toxic fog. Tommy Morrison's hand dropped to his desk with an audible slap. "Her? But she never even talks in class. She probably doesn't understand the problems anyway." Ashley whispered loudly enough for half the class to hear. "My mom says students who don't speak English at home have trouble with word problems." Mrs. Peterson's face reddened, but whether from embarrassment or anger, Maria couldn't tell. "Maria scored the highest on yesterday's practice test," she said firmly. "She'll be an asset to the team." The words should have felt like vindication, but instead, they felt like a spotlight burning into Maria's skin. She wanted to disappear into her chair, to somehow undo this moment that had painted a target on her back bigger than anything she'd experienced before. During recess, the whispers followed her like shadows. "She probably cheated," someone said, behind her, as she walked to the library instead of the playground. "My dad says those people are good at taking tests, but not at real thinking," another voice added, the casual cruelty delivered with the thoughtless confidence of children repeating adult prejudices they didn't even understand. But it was what happened during lunch that finally broke something inside Maria's carefully constructed armor of invisibility. She sat alone at her usual table near the cafeteria's back wall, methodically eating the rice and beans her mother had packed in a reused yogurt container. At the popular table across the room, Tommy Morrison stood up and began performing an exaggerated impression that made his friends erupt in laughter. "Oh, I know the answer," he said, in a high-pitched voice, with an overwrought accent nothing like Maria's actual speech pattern. "It's $847. I learned it from my daddy at the construction site." The laughter spread like wildfire through the cafeteria. Even some of the girls at Ashley's table giggled behind their hands, their eyes darting toward E. Maria to gauge her reaction. The sound cut through her chest like broken glass, sharp and jagged, and leaving wounds that would take years to heal properly. Maria's hands shook as she closed her lunch container, the rice suddenly tasting like sawdust in her mouth. She wanted to run to the bathroom and hide until the school day ended. She wanted to go home and tell her father she felt sick so she wouldn't have to face tomorrow. She wanted to disappear entirely from Roosevelt Elementary and never come back. But as she sat there, surrounded by the echoing laughter and cruel mimicry, something else began to grow in the space where her embarrassment had lived. It started, small, like a seed of heat in her chest, but it grew with each passing second until it filled her entire body with something she'd never felt before in these halls: anger. Pure, righteous anger at being mocked for the very intelligence they'd dismissed. Fury at being reduced to a stereotype by children who had never worked a day in their lives, who had never helped their parents navigate a world designed to exclude them, who had never felt the weight of representing an entire community every time they opened their mouths. Without thinking, she spoke. The words came out louder than she'd ever spoken in school, carrying across the cafeteria with startling clarity. "You're right, Tommy. I did learn math from my father. Because while your dad was teaching you to make fun of people who look different from you, my dad was teaching me that numbers don't care what language you speak or where you come from. They only care if you're smart enough to understand them." Dead silence. 50 pairs of eyes turned to her, including those of the lunch monitors who had stopped their conversations to stare at the quiet girl who had just found her voice. Maria walked away, but this time she didn't run. That wasn't just embarrassment burning in her chest anymore. That was determination finally waking up after 3 years of hibernation. And she was done being invisible. In her family's small 2-bedroom apartment that evening, Maria sat at the kitchen table with her father's construction calculator, the same battered device that had been her first introduction to the beauty of mathematics. The plastic casing was worn smooth from years of Roberto's calloused fingers, and several of the number buttons stuck slightly, requiring the precise pressure that Maria had learned to apply instinctively. On the table beside her lay a folder she'd never shown to anyone at school, a collection of certificates, ribbons, and newspaper clippings that told a story Roosevelt Elementary had never bothered to learn. At the top of the pile sat a faded blue ribbon from the Regional Math Olympiad, earned when she was only 9 years old and competing against students 2 grades ahead of her. The newspaper clipping beneath it showed a younger version of Maria, her smile radiant as she stood beside other young mathematicians from across the state. The headline read, "Local Student Breaks Records at State Competition." The article mentioned how she'd solved problems in multiple languages, switching effortlessly between English and Spanish to check her work, using the linguistic flexibility that Roosevelt Elementary saw as a limitation rather than a superpower. But the memory that mattered most wasn't captured in any photograph or certificate. It lived in the scent of sawdust and concrete that still clung to her father's work clothes, in the sound of his voice teaching her that numbers were the universal language of building something beautiful from nothing. She remembered being 7 years old, standing in the skeleton of a house her father was helping to frame, watching him calculate load-bearing requirements and stress distributions with the same calculator that now sat before her. While other children her age were learning basic addition, Roberto was teaching Maria about angles and proportions, about the mathematics hidden in every building that touched the sky. "Mira, mija," he would say, pointing to the blueprint spread across a makeshift table of plywood and sawhorses. "Look how the numbers tell us exactly where each piece belongs. Mathematics doesn't lie, and it doesn't care who your parents are or what language you speak at home. If you understand the numbers, you can build anything." Those afternoon lessons had continued even after the accident that changed everything. Maria closed her eyes and could still see the hospital room where her father had lain for 3 weeks. His right leg shattered in a fall from scaffolding that should have been safer. That would have been safer if the construction company had invested in proper equipment instead of cutting corners to maximize profits. The medical bills had consumed their savings like hungry flames. Roberto's recovery meant months of physical therapy they couldn't afford, pain medication that cost more than their weekly grocery budget, and the gradual realization that construction work might be too dangerous for a man whose daughter needed him healthy more than she needed the extra income from hazardous jobs. It was during those long hospital visits that Maria had discovered her gift extended far beyond helping with construction calculations. While her father slept, she would work through the math workbooks her teacher had assigned. But instead of stopping at the assigned problems, she would create her own. She would calculate the trajectory needed for pain medication to be most effective, figure out the statistical probability of recovery rates for different types of fractures, and determine the mathematical relationship between physical therapy frequency and healing speed. The nurses began to notice the quiet girl in the corner, who always seemed to be scribbling numbers on spare pieces of paper. One evening, Nurse Jennifer approached Maria with a curious expression. "Honey, what are you working on over there?" Maria had looked up, shy but proud, and shown her calculations about medication timing and dosage efficiency. Nurse Jennifer's eyes widened as she traced through Maria's work, checking the mathematical relationships Maria had identified between different treatment variables. "This is incredible," she whispered. "Have you shown this to anyone?" But Maria hadn't. At school, she was the quiet girl who struggled with English presentations and ate lunch alone. Her mathematical brilliance felt like a secret language she spoke only with her father, a private world where her accent didn't matter and her worn clothes didn't mark her as different. The last time she'd openly shared her mathematical insights at school had been in 3rd grade, when she'd corrected a mistake in the textbook during a geometry lesson. The teacher had brushed off her observation, and several classmates had rolled their eyes at the know-it-all who couldn't even pronounce isosceles correctly. But this time, Maria didn't cry, as she remembered that moment of dismissal. Instead, she turned to a fresh page in her notebook and started to calculate. She began with the math competition problems Mrs. Peterson had distributed, solving each one methodically, showing every step of her work in handwriting so precise it looked like printed text. When she finished the official practice problems, she created her own word problems that reflected the real world she knew, problems about calculating the cost of medical bills, determining the most efficient grocery shopping strategies, figuring out the mathematics of making minimum wage stretch to cover maximum dreams. "There it is," she whispered to herself as she looked at pages filled with elegant mathematical solutions. It was always there. Now it's time to let them see it. The school was still asleep at 6:30 a.m. when Maria stepped through the front doors of Roosevelt Elementary, her footsteps echoing in hallways that felt different in the pre-dawn quiet. She moved with purpose now, no longer the invisible girl who tried to blend into the background, but someone with a mission that couldn't wait for regular school hours. She entered the math classroom through the door Mrs. Peterson always left unlocked for early arriving students. The fluorescent lights flickered on with their familiar hum, illuminating the whiteboard where yesterday's problems still lingered in faded dry erase marker. But Maria wasn't interested in yesterday's problems. She had brought tomorrow's solutions. From her backpack, she withdrew a folder containing not just the competition problems Mrs. Peterson had assigned, but 15 additional problems Maria had created herself. Each one was a masterpiece of mathematical storytelling, weaving together real-world scenarios with complex calculations that would challenge even the most advanced students. No hesitation. Maria moved to the whiteboard and began writing, her small hands guiding the marker with the precision of an architect drafting blueprints. She started with the official competition problem about carnival costs, but instead of just providing the answer, she broke down every step of the solution process. She showed 3 different approaches to solving the same problem, highlighting how mathematical thinking could be flexible and creative while still arriving at the same correct conclusion. But then she went further. Below the official problem, Maria began writing her own mathematical stories. One problem calculated the hourly wage needed for a family of 3 to afford rent in their school district, requiring students to work with percentages, ratios, and real-world financial literacy. Another determined the most cost-effective grocery shopping strategy when working with a limited budget and multiple store locations, incorporating distance calculations, unit pricing, and time management mathematics. Each problem was more than just numbers on a board. They were windows into the mathematical thinking that happened in households where every dollar had to be calculated, where intelligence wasn't a luxury, but a survival tool, where children learned advanced problem-solving skills, not from expensive tutoring, but from the daily necessity of making limited resources stretch to cover unlimited dreams. When she finished, Maria looked at her work covering 3 whiteboards. In precise, elegant mathematical arguments, there was nothing else to say. She had transformed the classroom into a gallery of mathematical art that told the story of who she really was. Not the quiet girl in the back corner, but a mathematical mind that could see patterns and solutions others missed. She quietly gathered her materials and left, locking the door behind her just as the first buses began pulling into the school parking lot. At 8:15 a.m., Mrs. Peterson entered her classroom and stopped dead in her tracks. The whiteboards were covered in mathematical work so advanced and beautifully presented that she had to read through each problem twice to fully appreciate the sophistication of the thinking involved. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hand covering her mouth as she realized the implications of what she was seeing. By 8:30, word had spread through the faculty lounge. Teachers began filtering into Mrs. Peterson's classroom to see the mathematical display that had appeared overnight, like some kind of academic miracle. Principal Martinez arrived at 8:45, followed by the district's math curriculum coordinator, who had been called in for an emergency consultation. "Who did this?" Principal Martinez asked, his voice hushed with the kind of reverence usually reserved for art museums. Mrs. Peterson knew, but saying it out loud felt like admitting to years of professional blindness. "I believe it was Maria Rodriguez. She's been in my class for 3 years, and I've never—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that would acknowledge how thoroughly she had failed to see the brilliance sitting in her back corner. "This could be featured in high school mathematics journals," the curriculum coordinator murmured, tracing through Maria's solution pathways with an expression of growing amazement. The level of sophisticated thinking here is extraordinary. And these original problems, they're teaching tools that connect mathematical concepts to real-world applications better than anything in our current textbooks. Within minutes, photos of the whiteboards were spreading through the school's social media accounts. The district superintendent received a call at home. Parents began hearing about the mathematical genius at Roosevelt Elementary, who had turned a simple classroom assignment into a masterclass in mathematical thinking. The local news picked up the story by lunchtime. "Young mathematical mind transforms school assignment into teaching tool," read the headline on Channel 7's education segment. The reporter interviewed students who admitted they finally understood mathematical concepts that had confused them for years, all because Maria's problems showed them why the math mattered. By the time school ended that day, Maria's mathematical display had been viewed by hundreds of people, shared thousands of times on social media, and featured in educational blogs across the state. But Maria herself had spent the entire day in classes, unaware that her quiet morning work had sparked a revolution in how Roosevelt Elementary thought about mathematical talent and where it might be hiding in plain sight. They pulled the security footage from the hallway cameras at 3:45 p.m., and there, she was on the grainy black-and-white monitor. Maria Rodriguez, arriving at school in the pre-dawn darkness, with her weathered backpack and determined stride, entering the math classroom while the rest of Roosevelt Elementary still slept. "That's the custodian's daughter," whispered Ms. Thompson from the front office, her voice carrying the surprise of someone who had processed Maria's free lunch applications and emergency contact forms for 3 years without ever really seeing the child behind the paperwork. Principal Martinez had called an emergency meeting in his office, the kind usually reserved for disciplinary issues or crisis management. But this wasn't about punishment. It was about a reckoning. Seated around his conference table were Mrs. Peterson, the district curriculum coordinator, the school counselor, and two teachers who had taught Maria in previous grades, all trying to reconcile the mathematical brilliance on the whiteboards. With the quiet, invisible student they thought they knew. Maria sat across from them at 4:15 p.m., still wearing her faded jeans and carefully ironed shirt, her hair in the same neat braid her mother had woven that morning before her shift at the UID hospital cafeteria. Her worn notebook rested on the table between them like evidence in a trial where everyone was simultaneously the defendant and the jury. "Maria," Principal Martinez began, his voice gentler than she'd ever heard it, "we need to talk about what happened in Mrs. Peterson's classroom this morning." For a moment, Maria's stomach dropped. Had she gotten in trouble for using the classroom without permission? Had she violated some rule she didn't know existed? Her mind began calculating the potential consequences, the way she always did when faced with uncertainty. But then she noticed something different in their expressions. This wasn't the familiar look of adults preparing to discipline a student who had stepped out of line. This was something else entirely, something that looked almost like awe, mixed with regret. "You want to know who I am," she said quietly, her voice steadier than it had ever been in this building. "So, I'll tell you." She opened her notebook to the first page, where she kept the newspaper clipping about the state math competition. Her fingers traced the headline as she began to speak, and for the first time in 3 years at Roosevelt Elementary, she told her story without translating, without softening the edges, without making herself smaller to fit into other people's expectations. She told them about learning mathematics in her father's construction sites, where precision meant the difference between buildings that stood and buildings that fell. She described the afternoon lessons in their apartment kitchen, where Roberto would spread blueprints across the table and teach her that mathematical thinking was about seeing patterns that others missed, about finding solutions that seemed impossible until you understood the underlying structure. She explained how her father's accident had changed their family's trajectory, but not her mathematical passion, how she'd spent months in hospital waiting rooms creating her own word problems, calculating medication dosages, and recovery probabilities, while social workers discussed their family's financial hardship in hushed tones that assumed Maria couldn't understand the implications of what they were saying. "I've been doing advanced mathematics since I was 7 years old," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each sentence. "I've won state competitions and regional contests. I've tutored high school students in calculus concepts during weekend programs at the community center. But here, in this school, I learned to hide what I could do because being smart while speaking with an accent, being brilliant while eating free lunch, being excellent while wearing the same 3 shirts in rotation, that made people uncomfortable." Mrs. Peterson's face had gone pale. "Maria, I had no idea. Your test scores were good, but you never participated in class discussions. You never raised your hand for advanced problems. Because the one time I did raise my hand in 3rd grade, Mrs. Williams told me I was showing off and asked me to let other students have a turn to think. Because when I corrected a mistake in the 4th grade textbook, Mr. Johnson said I must have misunderstood the question since the textbook couldn't be wrong. Because every time I demonstrated what I actually knew, I was told I was being inappropriate or aggressive or too eager." The silence in the room was deafening. Around the table, educators who had spent their careers believing they championed student success were confronting the reality of their own unconscious biases, the ways they had systematically overlooked and underestimated a student whose brilliance had been hiding in plain sight. "I didn't leave mathematics," Maria said, closing her notebook and looking directly at each person around the table. "Mathematics never left me. I just learned that some places don't want to see what I can do, so I stopped showing them." In that quiet office, with afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked the playground where she'd spent 3 years eating lunch alone, they finally saw Maria Rodriguez not as the quiet girl who struggled with English presentations, not as the free lunch recipient who needed extra support, but as the mathematical prodigy who had been teaching herself advanced concepts while they taught remedial skills to students with half her ability. The recognition was 3 years too late, but it was finally completely real. The next morning, Maria stepped into Roosevelt Elementary like always, through the front doors at exactly 7:45 a.m., her backpack slung over one shoulder, her notebook clutched against her chest. But something was different in the air, a shift in the atmosphere that felt like the moment right before lightning strikes. The hallways that had been filled with indifferent chatter yesterday morning were unusually quiet. Students lined the corridors, their eyes following her as she walked toward her locker. But instead of the usual mixture of disregard and dismissal, their expressions carried something Maria had never seen directed toward her before: respect. Then it started. A slow clap from somewhere near the main office, picked up by other students until it became a wave of applause that followed her down the hallway. Seventh graders she'd never spoken to nodded at her with genuine admiration. Sixth graders whispered to their friends, "That's her. That's the math genius." "Maria," called out Jessica Martinez, a popular eighth grader who had never acknowledged her existence before. "That stuff you put on the whiteboards was incredible. My older brother is in high school calculus, and he said your problems were harder than anything he's studying." At her locker, Maria found a small crowd had gathered. Tommy Morrison stood at the edge of the group, his usual swagger replaced by something that looked suspiciously like humility. "Hey, Maria," he said, his voice lacking the mocking tone she'd grown accustomed to. "I wanted to say I'm sorry about yesterday, about all the days before yesterday. I was being stupid." Ashley Chen stepped forward, her perfectly styled hair framing a face that showed genuine contrition. "We all were. I didn't know, none of us knew how brilliant you are. But that's not an excuse for how we treated you." The apologies continued throughout the morning. Students who had dismissed her, teachers who had underestimated her, staff members who had processed her paperwork without ever seeing her potential, all of them finding ways to acknowledge that they had failed to recognize the extraordinary person who had been walking among them for 3 years. But the real transformation came during first period math class. Mrs. Peterson entered the room with an energy Maria had never seen before, her eyes bright with the excitement of someone who had discovered treasure in her own backyard. "Class," she announced, "I have an incredible opportunity to share with you. Yesterday, we learned that we have been sharing our classroom with one of the most gifted mathematical minds in the state of California." She gestured toward the whiteboards, which still displayed Maria's work from the morning before. The district had decided to leave the problems up indefinitely, turning Mrs. Peterson's classroom into an unofficial gallery of mathematical thinking that other schools were already requesting permission to visit. Maria Rodriguez has been selected to represent not just our school, but our entire district at the National Mathematics Competition in Washington, D.C. She will be competing against students from across the country, many of whom attend specialized mathematics academies and have been preparing for this competition their entire academic careers. The room erupted in applause, but Mrs. Peterson raised her hand for silence. That's not all. The California State University system has offered Maria a full scholarship for dual enrollment, allowing her to begin taking college-level mathematics courses while still completing her elementary education. She will be the youngest student in the program's history. Maria felt her heart racing, not with anxiety this time, but with the pure joy of possibilities finally opening before her like doors she'd been waiting years for someone to unlock. But here's what makes this even more special. Mrs. Peterson continued, "Maria has made one condition for accepting these opportunities. She wants to create a mathematics tutoring program here at Roosevelt Elementary, taught by students for students, where anyone who struggles with math can receive help from peers who understand their challenges. In other words," Mrs. Peterson smiled, "our mathematical genius wants to make sure no other student ever feels left behind or overlooked. She wants to build a community where every type of intelligence is recognized and celebrated. Under one condition," Maria had told the district administrators, "I want to help other kids who feel invisible. I want them to know that being smart doesn't require being wealthy, and being talented doesn't require fitting into anyone else's expectations. Later that afternoon, the auditorium was packed for an impromptu assembly. Students, teachers, parents, and community members filled every seat to hear Maria speak about mathematics, perseverance, and the danger of judging potential by appearance. She stepped up to the podium, no longer the quiet girl hiding in the back corner, but a confident young mathematician ready to share her vision with the world. Every person in this room has something extraordinary inside them, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone. The tragedy isn't when people fail to develop their gifts. The tragedy is when we fail to see those gifts because we're looking for them in the wrong places or expecting them to look a certain way. She paused, looking out over the crowd of faces that had ignored her for so long. Mathematics taught me that every problem has a solution, but the most important problems aren't on whiteboards. They're in how we see each other, how we value each other, and how we make sure everyone gets the chance to show the world what they can do. The entire auditorium rose to their feet. The applause was thunderous, but more than that, it was genuine. The sound of a community finally understanding what they had almost lost through their own blindness. 6 months later, Maria Rodriguez walked through the halls of Roosevelt Elementary with a different kind of invisibility. Not the invisibility of being overlooked, but the invisibility that comes from belonging so completely that your presence feels natural and necessary. The tutoring program she'd created had transformed the school's approach to mathematics education. Students who had struggled with basic concepts were now solving complex problems, not because the math had become easier, but because they finally had teachers who understood that intelligence comes in many forms and speaks many languages. Father Roberto attended every tutoring session, not as a parent checking on homework, but as a guest instructor who taught students about the mathematics hidden in construction, in budgeting, in the everyday miracles of making dreams reality. With limited resources, the same calloused hands that had once made him feel out of place at parent-teacher conferences now drew geometric diagrams on whiteboards, while children who looked like Maria learned that their parents' wisdom was valuable knowledge worth sharing. The National Mathematics Competition had been just the beginning. Maria's performance in Washington, D.C. had earned her recognition from universities across the country, but more importantly, it had shown other students from underestimated communities that academic excellence wasn't reserved for those who fit traditional expectations. On a quiet Tuesday morning in April, Maria sat in the same back corner where she'd spent 3 years feeling invisible. But now that corner was surrounded by other students, some struggling with fractions, others working on advanced algebra, all of them learning that mathematics was a language of possibility rather than exclusion. Mrs. Peterson, who had become Maria's mentor and advocate, often marveled at how one morning's courage had transformed not just one student's trajectory, but an entire school's culture. The whiteboard problems from that transformative day had been preserved and published in educational journals, studied by teachers across the country who wanted to learn how to recognize hidden brilliance in their own classrooms. But perhaps the most important change was the simplest one. When new students enrolled at Roosevelt Elementary, especially those who arrived with accents, free lunch applications, and the quiet demeanor that often masks exceptional minds, they found a community that looked for their strengths rather than their deficits, that celebrated their differences rather than trying to erase them. Maria's story became the school's story, that excellence isn't defined by privilege, that intelligence doesn't require perfect English, and that sometimes the most extraordinary gifts come wrapped in the most ordinary-looking packages. Every student deserves to be seen. Every mind deserves to be challenged. And every person deserves the chance to show the world what they're truly capable of achieving. Because the greatest tragedy isn't failing to solve difficult problems. It's failing to see the brilliant problem solvers who are sitting right in front of us, waiting for someone to finally notice what they've been capable of all along.